U.S. Air Force, shoot and kill a runaway alien at Fort Dix. Major George Filer was an Air Force intelligence officer, who not only had an extraordinary encounter with a massive UFO on radar over the United Kingdom, but later, in the 1970s while he was at McGuire Air Force Base, in New Jersey, found out that an extraterrestrial biological entity had been shot at Fort Dix. The extraterrestrial fled to adjacent McGuire Air Force Base, where it died on the tarmac. He testifies that this life form was then picked up and taken to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Afterwards, many of the key personnel on the base who had a connection with this event were quickly transferred. Major Filer also points out that the ridicule factor has been very effective at silencing people who have seen ETs or UFOs, and has helped to maintain secrecy. It was on the morning of January 18, 1978, when New Jersey State Police requested entry onto McGuire Air Force Base. Along with the adjacent Fort Dix base, UFOs had been reported earlier in the evening. But what the police said they were looking for was far stranger than just lights in the sky. When asked just exactly why the state troopers needed access to the base, they explained that an MP at Fort Dix had seen a low-flying object that had passed over his car. As he looked back to the road below, he hit the brakes in a panic. Standing in front of his vehicle in the headlights was a small being with a large head, black eyes, and a very slender body. The MP panicked, getting out of the car and pulling his .45 automatic. He demanded that the being lay on the ground, and when it didn't comply, he began to shoot. Wounded, the being fled the scene, supposedly hopping the fence between the bases, ran down a deserted airfield runway at McGuire, and eventually fell to the ground, dying. The guard on duty at this point, one Sergeant Jeff Morse, presumably a pseudonym, allowed the police onto the runway to search for the being. There, they found the body, crouched in a fetal position, not breathing. It was indeed dead. Shocked, but keeping with protocol, they began to rope off the area. Suddenly, a group of military officers in blue berets arrived, distancing Morse from the area. Morse watched on from afar as this new group clad in blue berets, whom he'd never seen before, seemed to take charge of the situation. UFO researcher Leonard Springfield once interviewed Morse about the being itself. Springfield stated the following about how Morse described it. Never close enough to observe details such as facial features, or its hands and feet. He did recall that, under the glare of truck headlights, the skin of the unclad, hairless body was wet, shiny, and snake-like. The entity was about 4 feet in height with a large head, slender torso, thin arms and legs, and overall, of grayish-brown coloration. Springfield also inquired about the retrieval operation itself as these Blue Beret officers worked their secretive magic. Springfield stated that, while on patrol, Morse watched the Blue Beret specialists spray the corpse from a portable tank and cover it with a white sheet. Before the body was carefully placed onto a platform and a wooden frame built round it. This was finally placed into a large square silver metal container, about 10 by 10 feet with indistinguishable blue markings. After this, a C-141 cargo aircraft landed on site, the being was loaded on board, and it has been suspected that it took off towards Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Supposedly the same base that the 1947 Roswell crash bodies were shipped off to. Morse and the police officer were separated and both were told that if they ever spoke of what they'd seen that day, they would immediately be stripped of their duties and their respective jobs. It was 2 days later when Morse and a few other witnesses were shipped off to Wright-Patterson and received intense interrogations. In statements by Morse many years later, he stated that, "They told me about my duty to keep my mouth shut. I signed a form and it is supposed to bind me for life." Morse was brought back to McGuire AFB, debriefed by his superiors, and the incident was never spoken of again after that. It didn't take long for Morse to start asking around about just exactly what he'd seen that night by other witnesses. When word of this got to his superiors, many of the witnesses were shipped overseas, including Morse, who soon found himself in Okinawa on desk duty. To this day, he admits that he's been constantly threatened not to speak of the event and that the military has gone to great lengths to keep him quiet, including personality and professional attacks, making it difficult for Morse to find employment in the law enforcement sector. If this wasn't extraordinary enough, another key witness came forward to corroborate this event. Major George Filer, now retired, was stationed at McGuire at the time as an intelligence officer. While not being present at the actual incident, he heard firsthand about it the following morning. In an interview with Caitlin Raymer and David Rupp of ABC News, Filer stated that, "Our security police went out there and found him, the alien body, at the end of the runway dead. They asked me to brief the general staff." While this briefing was later cancelled, Filer remained convinced that this event was truly bizarre, and the joint bases were doing everything in their power to contain it and keep everyone silent. While he couldn't prove that this alien being was of extraterrestrial origin, word around the base continued to spread, and all were convinced that this was a genuine UFO landing of some sort and the subsequent death of its extraterrestrial occupant. So did a panicked, trigger-happy MP actually shoot and kill an alien that night? The truth may never be known. The lid on this and so many other apparent incidents of this ilk have been so tightly wound shut, that those involved fear the worst for their jobs, and perhaps even their lives. But if this case of an alien termination is true, then we have more to fear than just military threats. We have an alien race expecting one of their own to eventually come home. They just probably weren't expecting it to be in a body bag. In an interview with Dr. Stephen Greer, Major George Filer states, "My name is George A. Filer, I was in the U.S. Air Force and my final rank was Major. I was a navigator in various aircraft and tanker transport aircraft. I was an intelligence officer most of my career, and in that period, frequently briefed generals and congressmen on our capabilities and the threat to our forces. Well, I was a briefing officer, and I would come to work, at 4 o'clock or so in the morning. On the morning of January 18, 1978, I drove through the main gate at McGuire, and I noticed that there were red lights out on the runway, and that probably something was going on out there. I didn't think too much about it until I got to the 21st Air Force Command Post, which was where I worked. I was the Deputy Director of Intelligence for the 21st Air Force, which controlled half the military aircraft that flew the presidents and the various VIPs from the Mississippi River around to India. We had some 300 aircraft, and we were flying all kinds of missions, almost anything that had to do with military airlift, we accomplished. This particular morning, when I went into the command post, I was met by the head of the command post, and he said that it had been a very exciting evening, that we had UFOs over McGuire all night, that one had apparently landed or, possibly, crashed at Fort Dix, and that when a military policeman came upon the alien, that he had pulled out a gun and shot him. And I said, "Foreigner, that kind of alien?" I was a little bit confused by him saying alien. And he said, "No, an alien from outer space." He was very specific about the fact that an alien from outer space had been shot at Fort Dix, and that he had run away after being wounded, and headed for McGuire. Now McGuire and Fort Dix just have a fence between them, and this alien apparently climbed the fence or went under it, and got to McGuire and died out on the end of the runway. The security police were out there and had captured the body, so to speak, and were guarding it. He said that a C-141 from Wright-Patterson was coming in to pick up the body. That made me stand up, because I didn't realize that Wright-Patterson had C-141s. I thought Military Airlift Command was the only one who owned C-141 aircraft, so I was like, my gosh, what's going on here? He said, "We want you to brief us at the stand-up general briefing this morning and explain what happened to everybody." And, I said, "You want me to tell General Tom Sadler and everybody in the command post that we captured an alien?" They said, "Yes, We want you to brief them this morning. Well, I did some checking around, and I called the 38th Military Airlift Wing Command Post to check with them to see if the story was the same as I was given. They said, yes, that they had heard the same information. They said that this actually did happen, that an alien was found on the base. Later that morning, I was told that they decided not to brief it in the stand-up briefing, so I didn't actually brief it. Later that morning, I carried the code word down to General Sadler's office, and I noticed some commotion going on in there, and that some of the security police people were there, looking rather disheveled. Since General Sadler was a stickler for everyone looking perfect, it was surprising to see these people that obviously needed shaves and were in fatigues, so then I knew that this might tie into the story that I had heard. After the briefing I went to the photo lab. Almost every day I went to the photo lab, because in these briefings, you have 4 screens and you have to keep them all filled up with pretty pictures, and so on. There, they indicated that they had taken pictures of something extraordinary, and I said, well, let me see them. The sergeant was handing them to me, when his master sergeant said, he can't see those, so all I knew is that they had some pictures that I wasn't allowed to see, but normally, being the general's briefer, I had never been stopped from seeing any pictures that they had. It was a very serious operation. There are nuclear assets on the base. They used to carry nuclear weapons back and forth to Europe, and I talked to one of the security policemen who claimed to have been out there. He indicated that he essentially saw a small body that could have been like a child, but it seemed to have a larger than normal head. One interesting thing is that many of the key personnel on the base at that time who had a connection with this event, were quickly transferred, from the wing commander on down, indicating that if you knew something, they tended to split you up, so to speak, so you couldn't talk about it. This was done within a matter of weeks. The security policeman told me that he was transferred within a few days. As a matter of fact, he was taken to Wright-Patterson within a day or two, debriefed by a number of people, and essentially told not to talk about it anymore. I also heard that they listened to this going on the radios, and they heard that this chase was on, that the alien had been shot at Fort Dix. They were chasing it towards McGuire. For whatever reason, it chose to run towards McGuire Air Force Base, and that both the state police and the military police were chasing this person or alien that came from what looked like a UFO. As I understand it, it was a disc-shaped craft. They indicated to me that the UFOs had been in the area for quite some time that evening, that they had them on radar, and that the tower operator had seen them. Some of the other aircraft in the area had apparently seen them as well. There were 6 or 8 people guarding the body, then there was the commander of the security police, and a few of us in the command post who knew of this event. I assume that General Sadler was briefed about it. SG, have you learned of other UFO events while you were in the military? GF, well, I happened to meet a lady who was at White Sands, and was an engineer working out there. She was out hiking one day, and she told me that she and a couple of her friends had come up to the top of a hill, and they had looked down in this valley, but only their heads were showing on the top of the hill. They just happened to be looking over, and down the way the path was, and they saw a UFO on the ground with a couple of little aliens picking up rocks and things. They watched it for an extensive period. It was only several hundred yards away from them, and they got a pretty good look at it. And eventually the aliens did see them, and they jumped in the craft and took off. I had personally never seen anything until about 1962, when we were flying tankers over England, and London Control asked us to intercept a UFO. We happened to be done with our refueling mission, and we accepted the assignment. We were just over the North Sea, and they asked us to fly to the center of England. We were doing some 400 miles an hour in a dive down to intercept this object. They gave us headings, and it was pretty much hovering in the Stonehenge area, Oxford, to the Stonehenge area, at 20-30 miles out. I got it on radar, and it was a very large return. We used to fly up by the 4th of Frith Bridge, which was kind of like the San Francisco Bridge. It is a very large bridge, and the return of the UFO was similar to that in size and intensity. In other words, it was a very large radar return. Obviously, London Control had it on their radar, and they were vectoring us to this object. When we got about a mile from the UFO, it just took off into space, several thousand miles an hour, almost directly up. Frankly, at least to my knowledge, we had nothing like that capability. My best guess is that it was a disc-type craft, but a fat disc. At least, there were lights something like this at the top and at the bottom. It was more than just a straight plate-like object. It had a dome on the top of it. If the radar return was accurate, it was probably 500 yards across in size, or something. I mean, it was a huge thing. We wrote it in the navigator's log. I also had a sighting here, where we live. This is Briarwood Lake in Medford, New Jersey. We had just moved into this house. We were asleep, I'm just guessing it was 3 o'clock in the morning, asleep with my wife, and, suddenly, the room got very bright in the middle of the night. I got up out of bed, and opened up the shade, and looked outside. I don't know if most people have seen a submarine surfacing with all the water coming up. Well, this was like a disc about 30 feet in diameter surfacing, and what looked to me like water coming off of it. Around the craft was this ionization, very similar to the aurora borealis. It moved across the lake for a while, and then flew off at a fairly high rate of speed. Because of that, I have checked with a lot of the neighbors, and it's amazing how many people have actually seen craft on these lakes. Also, occasionally I used to do briefings on the UFO sightings that had occurred around the world, to the generals. One that sticks out in my mind is 1976, there was a famous encounter near Tehran. Around that time, this particular colonel was telling me that the F-106 had set the world's record for speed. They had these aircraft going as fast as they could, and they would be diving on this UFO that was hovering in a valley in Colorado. Just like my experience in England, when they got near the craft, it took off and left them standing still. They were doing 1,500 miles per hour or something, whatever the top speed was at that time for these aircraft in a dive. But whoever was flying these had capabilities far beyond anything that we had for years and years. I think even today. I think these are something alien. It is a non-human craft that has a different form of propulsion and is coming here and doing reconnaissance. I've talked to a number of astronauts who have seen them, I've talked to other military pilots who have seen them, and I remember Captain Ramage, who I used to work for in Athens, Greece. He had one during the Korean War fly right off his wing, stay with him like for an hour, not only off his wing, but doing acrobat things around his aircraft. I don't know the exact percentage of people, but something like 10% of the pilots and air crews that you ask about it have had sightings. I sat in this room here a few years ago, and a colonel who was in intelligence told me he had his whole B-52 crew see a UFO. You know, these people don't volunteer and sit in front of the camera and tell about it, but there are an awful lot of people who have seen them. They know that they have advanced capabilities. They usually see some kind of a solid object that appears to be made of some kind of metal, usually a gunmetal gray. Particularly at night, people usually report various lights around them. SG, what happened to the ET at McGuire? GF, it seems to me that I was told that it was put in some kind of a casket and flown away. I also think that in 1947, in that time frame, something crashed out west. I think that something happened out there, at least based on what you might say is the talk in the military. The tendency is to make things classified when you don't know what's happening, secret, top secret or whatever, and if it comes down from the president, it's a very high classification, probably a code word above top secret. In other words, need to know that kind of thing, and once that caveat or designation is put on something, it's very difficult to get it downgraded. You can go to the archives and despite what they tell you, they have things going back to the Second World War that you still are not allowed to look at. Once these things are top secret, it just kind of moves on and forever stays top secret. You can base it on the fact, for example, that this craft had advanced technological capabilities, so you don't want the other side to know what you know, and how these things work. It's to your advantage to keep this secret. But, I think that it's time that these various programs come out. The way that it's been kept secret to this extent is through ridicule. If it was just a matter of it being top secret, I think most of the world would know about it today, but they put in a kind of ridicule factor. You will hear someone telling a story like this, and people will say, well, he must be crazy, he believes in UFOs. And, they brought this ridicule out when anyone saw anything, but my experience has been an awful lot of policemen have seen these, an awful lot of FBI have seen these, an awful lot of military have seen these. At times I used to carry nuclear weapons. In other words, I was mentally fit to carry nuclear weapons, but I'm not mentally fit if I see a UFO. This criticism and this ridicule have done more to keep the story from coming out than almost anything else.